You've probably heard that the average UK pension pot for someone your age sits around £107,000. That figure gets used two different ways. It either tells you that you're fine, or it tells you to panic because you're behind. Both reactions come from a number that was never built to describe your life. Here's the part almost nobody puts next to it. The new state pension now pays £12,547 a year. The tax-free personal allowance sits at £12,570. That leaves you exactly £23 of tax-free room before every extra pound your own pension pays out gets taxed at 20% or more. I've watched this happen to people who did everything right. They saved for 30 years, they checked the same headlines you're checking now, and they still felt behind. The problem was never their effort or their willpower. It was the ruler they were being handed to measure themselves against. If you're 55 to 65, checking your pension statements every few months, wondering why a pot that sounds healthy doesn't feel like it will buy you a comfortable life, you're not imagining that gap. You're just working from the wrong number. In this video, I'll show you why that £107,000 average and the £185,000 figure that sometimes gets quoted next to it are both the wrong yardstick for your own retirement. Then I'll walk you through a three-step framework that replaces the national average with your own personal number, starting with that £23 gap the headlines always seem to miss. The £107,000 figure everyone quotes is the median pension wealth for people aged 55 to 64, according to the Office for National Statistics. It sits in the middle of the pile, which sounds sensible until you look at the mean instead. The average pension wealth for the same age group works out closer to £185,000, and that gap alone tells you the numbers are being pulled around by something. The Office for National Statistics tracks this gap deliberately because a handful of very large pensions, often decades-long careers in the public sector, or a generous final salary scheme, skew the top end enormously. That matters to you because it means the typical comparison splashed across the news was never designed to represent someone with an ordinary workplace pension and a few gaps in their contributions along the way. Comparing your own savings to that £185,000 mean is like measuring your height against the tallest person in the room and wondering why you feel short. It has nothing to do with how well you're actually doing. There's a second distortion sitting underneath the first one. Pension providers often report an average pot size of around £15,000 to £20,000, and that figure gets repeated as if it means something on its own. Most people your age hold 4 or 5 separate pots from different jobs over a working life. Providers are measuring the pot. You need to be measuring the person because that person is the one who has to retire on every pot added together, not just one of them. Try this instead. If 9 people each have £10,000 saved, and one person has £1 million, the average across all 10 works out at £109,000. None of those 10 people actually has £109,000 sitting anywhere. The number is real. It just doesn't belong to anyone in the room. So which figure have you actually been comparing yourself to? The median, the mean, or your own bills? Most people never stop to ask. Your own number isn't a line on an ONS spreadsheet. Call it your identity protection line instead. The specific sum that keeps your front door locked, your heating on, and your life running the way you want it to, regardless of what the average person supposedly spends. But even if you're sitting on that median £107,000, there's a tax cliff waiting for you that has nothing to do with averages at all. And it changed on the 6th of April this year. For years, people were told the state pension sat neatly inside their tax-free personal allowance, with plenty of room left over for a private pension on top. That stopped being true from April 2026. The triple lock pushed the new state pension up by 4.8%, taking it to £12,547 a year. The personal allowance, frozen at £12,570, didn't move at all. Do the subtraction and you get £23. That's the entire tax-free space you have left once the state pension lands in your account each year. Every pound your private pension or SIP pays out after that gets taxed at 20%, and it climbs higher still if your total income pushes you into a higher band. This didn't happen by accident. The personal allowance has been frozen since 2021, while wages and pensions have kept climbing with inflation and the triple lock. Economists call this fiscal drag, more of your income creeping into taxable territory every year without a single tax rate ever changing. The state pension chasing the frozen allowance is about as clear an example of that squeeze as you'll ever see. I used to tell people the state pension was a bonus sitting on top of their tax-free allowance, extra room before the taxman took any interest. I was wrong about that, and it's worth saying plainly. Right now, the state pension effectively is your allowance. Almost nothing is left over for the private pot you spent decades building. Picture the person sitting on that average £107,000 pot. If they draw £7,453 a year to cover their gap, roughly a fifth of that withdrawal, close to £1,490, disappears in tax before it ever reaches their current account. That's real spending power lost every single year, just from timing and structure, not from bad investing. This is where the framework starts, with something I'll call the floor. Your floor is your state pension income, £12,547 a year for the full amount, set against what your actual bills cost to run your life. Say your bills, council tax, energy, insurance, the ordinary cost of a year, come to £20,000. Subtract the £12,547 state pension, and you're left with a gap of £7,453 that has to come from somewhere else. That gap is the number that actually matters, not the £107,000 average sitting in a spreadsheet somewhere. Knowing your gap tells you what your private pension has to produce every year, not what it looks like sitting untouched in a statement. Knowing your gap is step one. But there's a second clock running quietly in the background on the other account you've been treating as a tax-free safe haven, and it changes everything in under 12 months. There's a second deadline sitting quietly in your diary, separate from the state pension one. From the 6th of April, 2027, the amount you can put into a cash ISA each year drops to £12,000 if you're under 65. The overall ISA allowance of £20,000 stays the same, and savers 65 and over keep the higher cash limit. But for most people your age, a chunk of what used to be simple, tax-free saving room is about to shrink. The change is part of a wider push to get long-term savers into stocks and shares instead of cash, on the idea that shares tend to outpace inflation over a long enough stretch. Whatever the reasoning behind it, the practical effect for you is less tax-free shelter available from underneath your own feet, right as the tax squeeze on your pension is tightening from above. That matters because the ISA has quietly been doing the work of a bridge between your bills and your state pension. Less room in it means less flexibility exactly when you're likely to need it most. Now add the harder question underneath all of this. According to ONS life expectancy data, a 60-year-old man today has roughly a 1 in 4 chance of living to 92. That's not a small tail risk tucked away in a footnote. That's 1 in 4 men on this channel, in your own street, in your own circle of friends. This is why that number changes the whole conversation around the £107,000 average pot. Draw £7,000 a year from it to cover your gap, and it lasts around 15 years. Start at 60, and that pot runs dry at 75. If you're one of the 1 in 4 who reaches 92, you're looking at 17 years with no private pension left at all, relying entirely on the state pension alone. This isn't a new risk either. Anyone who was drawing down a pension in 2008 remembers watching it fall by close to half at the exact moment they needed to start taking money out. We're not in a crash right now, but we are in a stretch of inflation that has quietly cut the real spending power of a static £107,000 pot by something like a fifth over the last 5 years. The number on the statement hasn't moved. What it can actually buy has. So the question was never just do you have enough today? It's whether what you have today still buys the same life in 15 or 20 years. Getting that right comes down to a safety margin most people never build in, and it's worth about 20% of everything you've calculated so far. You already have the first piece of the framework, your gap, the difference between your state pension and what your life actually costs to run. Now comes the part almost every average completely ignores. The buffer for the spending that doesn't happen every month but always happens eventually. The Pensions Policy Institute recommends building in a safety margin of around 20% on top of your baseline gap to cover the lumpy costs of real life, a new roof, a dental implant, replacing a car that's finally given up. These aren't emergencies in the dramatic sense. They're just ordinary parts of getting older that don't show up in a monthly budget. Think about the last few years of your own life. A boiler replacement, a hip that needed sorting privately because the NHS waiting list ran into years, a car insurance renewal that jumped for no obvious reason. None of that sat in anyone's monthly budget, and all of it was entirely predictable in the sense that something like it always turns up. Take that £7,453 gap from before. Add 20%, close to £1,490, and your real annual need from private savings comes to £8,943. That's the number your pension actually has to produce every single year, not the number sitting on the front page of your statement. Here's where most people stop looking at the wrong thing entirely. They obsess over the size of the pot instead of what it can reliably pay out. Flip the question around. Instead of asking how big is my pot, ask how much yield my number actually requires. Using a 4% withdrawal rate, a common and reasonably cautious guide among retirement planners, an £8,943 annual need means you actually need a pot of £223,575 to sustain it for the long haul. The 4% figure isn't arbitrary. It comes from decades of research into how a diversified portfolio can be drawn down without running dry across a retirement that might last 25 or 30 years, allowing for the years markets fall, as well as the years they rise. It's a guide, not a guarantee, but it's a far more honest starting point than simply hoping a fixed pot lasts as long as you do. Sit with that for a second. The average £107,000 pot everyone quotes covers less than half of what a typical person in your position actually needs. That's not a small shortfall you can shrug off. It's the difference between a retirement that comfortably absorbs the bad years and one that runs out exactly when you can least afford it to. None of this means you've failed, and it isn't a reason to panic either. It means the target you've been comparing yourself to was simply the wrong target from the start. Once you know your floor, your gap, and your real number, you're working from the truth instead of a headline. If you're realizing the averages you've been comparing yourself against were never built to describe your situation, you know what to do. Subscribe, because we're building a channel full of people who would rather work from their real number than from someone else's headline. Let's run the framework against a real situation instead of a spreadsheet. Call him Mark, 58 years old, made redundant with no warning after 20 years in the same job. He has the average pot, £107,000 sitting in a workplace pension, and a mortgage that still needs paying every month. The unprepared version of this story goes like this. Mark panics. He starts drawing from his pension straight away to cover the mortgage, because it's the only pot of money he can see. Because of the £23 rule we talked about earlier, almost everything he withdraws gets taxed at 20% from day one. His £107,000 doesn't just shrink from the withdrawals themselves, it shrinks roughly 30% faster than it would have done with a plan, because a fifth of every pound never reaches him at all. Now run the same situation through the framework instead. Mark has an ISA sitting alongside his pension, built up over the years specifically for a moment like this. He uses that first, tax-free, to bridge the gap between now and the point his state pension is due to start at 67. His pension pot stays untouched and keeps compounding in the background, and he never triggers the emergency tax trap that hits an unplanned first withdrawal. I've seen this in my own circle more than once. The panic draw, reaching for the pension the moment a redundancy letter lands, is one of the single biggest destroyers of retirement wealth in this country, and it has nothing to do with bad investment choices. It's simply the wrong account being used at the wrong moment, under pressure, without a plan already in place. The maths in this scenario isn't complicated. Knowing which account to draw from first and when is worth more over a retirement than almost any investment decision Mark could make. But there's a part of this that has nothing to do with maths at all. The fear that no number will ever feel like enough, no matter how carefully you plan. Here's something worth admitting plainly. We're wired to check the average because it feels like a safe herd to belong to. If everyone else has roughly what you have, surely you'll be fine too. It's a completely normal instinct, and it's also exactly the instinct that's been leading you astray this whole time. It's normal to feel a flash of shame when your own number sits below that £185,000 mean everyone quotes. But remember what's actually sitting inside that figure. It includes a small number of people with multi-million-pound pensions built over entire careers in the city or decades in a generous final salary scheme. Comparing your real, lived situation to their highlight reel was never a fair fight, and it was never really about you at all. The shift that actually helps isn't complicated, even if it takes a while to feel natural. Stop asking, "Am I average?" Start asking, "Am I covered?" One question tells you where you rank against strangers you'll never meet. The other tells you whether your own life, your own bills, your own plans are actually going to work. There's one small, concrete step that makes this shift real instead of just a nice idea. Check your state pension forecast on gov.uk. It takes a few minutes, and it tells you your actual floor, not an estimate, not a national average, your own number, in pounds, starting on your own state pension age. People who know that number precisely report far less background anxiety about retirement than people who are still comparing themselves to headlines. Knowing your floor exactly doesn't fix everything, but it quiets a surprising amount of the noise. So the average pension figure isn't exactly a lie in the sense that someone made it up. It's a lie in the sense that it was never built to answer the question you're actually asking. It ignores the tax squeeze between your state pension and your personal allowance. It ignores how long you might actually live, and it blends pots and people together in a way that tells you almost nothing about your own situation. Your real number was never that complicated to find. Take your gap, the difference between your state pension and your bills. Add 20% for the lumpy costs that always turn up eventually. Multiply the result by 25. That's your number, the one that actually matters, not the one in the headline. You have more control over this than the average pension story ever suggested. Simply knowing your floor and your gap already puts you ahead of most people your age, who are still comparing themselves to a spreadsheet instead of their own bills. If you want to stay ahead of what's coming, the Cash ISA changes, landing in April 2027, the state pension age still climbing towards 67. Subscribe to Arthur's UK Retirement Guide. Let's get your actual number right, together.